Good morning, everyone. We are delighted that you are here with us this morning. My name is Gabriela Sanchez, and I am going to be your host today this morning at this webinar, which is Alone and Exploited, the Impact of U.S. Immigration Enforcement on Child Migration and Labor, which is being organized by the Collaborative Global Children's Issues here at Georgetown. So thank you so much to all of you for joining. As a quick introduction, while we are joined by anyone who may be just logging in a little bit late, the goal of our webinar is to amplify the very recent coverage, media coverage, that the issue of the arrival of migrant youth to the United States and to locations within the country have been generating. There's been significant media coverage concerning the employment of children, and this is mostly in very well established industries. And our hope, all of us coming together for this webinar was to situate these dynamics and the context of the ongoing migration control dynamics and the challenges that people are experiencing as they are arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border, but then also throughout cities in the interior of the country, and what the experiences of migrant youth have been. So just a very quick introduction, to let you know who we are here at the Collaborative. So the Collaborative seeks to foster cross-disciplinary research and dialogue on critical and emerging global children's issues, with a particular focus on children in adversity and their pathways to resilience. The objectives of the Collaborative include the establishing of Georgetown as a thought leader and convener on issues related to global child development, well-being, and protection, connecting and supporting faculty working on global children's issues, support research relevant to policy and practice around critical and emerging challenges affecting children globally, and engaging students through teaching, events, research, and other learning opportunities to deepen their knowledge and prepare them to effectively consider and serve children worldwide. We are, also, in addition to us working here as a collaborative and bringing, people together, and please feel free to reach out if you are interested in developing and being part of any of these objectives. This morning, we are joined by a stellar panel, and researchers who have spent many years in the field, and many of them who were actually, or who are part of families with whose relatives, whose members, were also migrants, or also experienced conditions of child labor that eventually led to them becoming involved in or exploring these topics. So today, really quickly, we'll just go through some other bios. We have Stephanie Canizales, who is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Merced, and whose research centers youth and the study of migration. Her forthcoming book, Sin Padres ni Papeles, interrogates how Central American and Mexican origin youth navigate coming of age without parents and legal immigration status in the United States. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Stephanie is the daughter of Salvadorian immigrants whose experiences motivate her commitment to scholarly advocacy. Catherine Monato is the Donald G. Herzberg Professor of International Migration in the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. She's a member of the Faculty Committee for the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues. Lauren Heidrich is an Associate Professor of Human Development at California State University in Long Beach. She's a visiting fellow at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and with the program in Latin American Studies at Princeton. She is also the author of Migrant Youth, Transnational Families and the State, Care and Contested Interests, and Migranthood, Youth in a New Era of Deportation. Yvonne Padilla Rodriguez is a Bridge to Faculty Postdoctoral Research Associate in the History Department at the University of Illinois in Chicago. A social and legal historian of child migration, her current book project traces the origins of undocumented youth labor trafficking, the school to deportation pipeline, and migrant child detention. Her writing has appeared in peer-reviewed academic venues, as well as national media outlets like the Washington Post, Time, and Teen Vogue. And last but not least, Michelle Statz is professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School and affiliated faculty with the University of Minnesota Law School. She's an anthropologist of law and a leading researcher in rural and indigenous access to justice. She is also involved in projects on global youth and mobility, the examination of best interests, and cost lawyering. Her first book, Lawyering and Uncertain Costs, Immigration Advocacy and Chinese Youth in the US, was published in 2018. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us this morning. I'm very excited, and I'm really appreciative of to all of you for waking up so early, especially in the case of Lauren and Steph, who are joining us all the way from California, and to all of you who are logging in from your respective corners of the world. And before we start, just really, I really want to thank Gillian Hovner, who was the executive director of the collaborative, for her leadership and her support, of this topic, especially at this time, while we are waiting for, there's expectation here on the border. I am, in fact, based on the U.S.-Mexico border, for changes that are coming. And we are also very grateful to the Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement, and in particular to Mary Gordon and Julia Murillo, who are assisting us with all of the logistics. If we are here today, it is because of their efforts. So thank you so much to all of you. We are going to have at the end of this conversation, we're not going to have individual presentations. We want it to be just more engaging dialogue. We're going to have a Q&A portion of the webinar, and we're going to ask you to write your questions there, and we'll go through them at the end of the session. So I want to, I think that we need just a little bit of context in terms of where we are, where we stand at this point, and what led us to decide to develop a webinar of this kind. In late February, Hannah Dreier, a wonderful journalist from the New York Times, published the first of what so far have been 3 articles concerning the conditions that migrant youth face once they have reached destination cities across the US. And here the poor and concerning conditions that they face in very well-established American industries. And the article was very detailed in terms of, again, the experiences of very young people, the conditions that they were facing within many of these manufacturing plants, and the forms of violence that many times they faced. Also, the amounts of debt that many of them carried from their countries of origin, and the forms of exploitation and abuse that they often faced, not only within the setting of the companies themselves, but also in the relationships or interactions that they forged with the people who sponsor their journeys, or also who engaged in what would amount to trafficking conditions. And we are, the hope, for this conversation is to expand but also to situate some of the points that were raised during, or that have continued to emerge as part of this investigation. There was a third part of this series that came out yesterday, where it's very clear that the White House has been aware all along of the conditions that young people have faced. And I think that this is one of the main points, right, that led us to want to have this conversation. The very fact that migrant child labor in the US, despite many of its representations, is nothing new. But we see this continued, the cycles of awareness. Suddenly there's an investigation that takes place, or a report that is written by an international organization, the uproar, the condemnation that follows, and then the topic goes away. And we wanted to, for that reason, to give a more historical context that also situated this dynamics and overall the employment of migrant youth, as part of this historical continuum. But that also involves looking at the very nature of what labor has been in, and again, this is specific forms of labor in the history of the country, and how it has been defined, from the onset by very clear markers, a very clear indication of racism and discrimination. So this is employment under exploitative conditions, under abusive conditions, has been part of the history of people of color and people who live in poverty in the country. And we have seen these practices emerge in very specific industries. In the case of domestic labor, agriculture, meatpacking plants. And specifically, most of the attention that these articles have generated have been in reference to US-bound migration from Latin America and the Caribbean, where, and as we will also be discussing this morning, there's this, and we are very much aware how the US has had a long-standing reliance, US industry has had a long-standing reliance on the labor of migrant workers and their children. And so it is important, right, that many times, many of these representations or most of the discourse that is mobilized concerning the employment of young people, in many instances leads to the criminalization of their parents, saying that, well, they are the ones that are, how can they be putting children under these conditions, or frames parents as victims as well. So they are being either portrayed as people who don't really care much about their children and who are exploiting, they are taking advantage of their labor, or people who are completely ignorant and unaware of the kinds of conditions that their children will face. And many times in that sense, this, permits or allows to obscure the more racist, the more classist dimensions, of this forms of labor. It also obscures, as we will see later on during our conversation, the experiences of indigenous children. Most of the children whose experience were documented or being documented in these articles are young people of indigenous origin. Most of them, for what we were able to understand, are from Central America, and specifically from Guatemala. Another element that I think is very important to emphasize is that while there is this, and we have to emphasize that many of these practices come from very well-established corporations and industries within the United States, at the bottom, at the core of many of these practices lies the fact that there is no mechanisms, there's no pathways for young people nor their families to access employment authorization in a fashion that is efficient, fast, and respectful, of the conditions that they face. So we see that in many cases, while again, the attention is paid to industries, we tend to forget that many of the children and their families have to rely on informal forms of employment, which we're going to be discussing as well. Having provided that context, I am going to give the floor, return to our panelists, and I am going to ask Professors Donato and Hebrink if they could provide us with a very quick overview of the current immigration enforcement landscape that children face, as they arrive to the United States.
Happy to jump in. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really grateful. I think we have to put the rise in child migration and immigration enforcement responses to it in historical and global context. I'm grateful for the space here today for us to do this collectively. Historically, Central American migration is situated within a legacy of colonialism, of US intervention in the region, of ongoing extractive development that pollutes soil and waterways and displaces entire communities, particularly indigenous communities. and government corruption that's now functionally part of the operating system in Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, and Mexico. Right, and to date, the Biden administration has attempted, I think, just to wish away the damage inflicted by decades of US interventionist policies, rather than address the historical and contemporary violence inflicted by these policies. Biden has adopted an enforcement-only response on the US-Mexico border and borderlands, in zones of transit in Mexico, and increasingly in Guatemala, and in countries of origin. So the US border, right, for example, I think most folks are aware of Title 42, which is a public health policy used to expel hundreds of thousands of migrants on public health grounds. It's created a situation, and parents and their children make a difficult decision to send a young person across the border alone, rather than remain in dangerous encampments in Mexico. Or they attempt to cross together and are separated by Customs and Border Patrol, rendering a young person unaccompanied. So those determined to be or rendered unaccompanied, right, are put in a series of 200 federal shelters, detention centers, really kind of, they use this euphemism of shelters, I'll refer to them as detention, run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where young people then await family reunification or sponsorship, federal foster care, or deportation, which I don't think we heard too much about in the article. In zones of transit, the Biden administration's continued an Obama-era policy under the Southern Border Program, which deploys financial, military, technological, and technical support to the Mexican military to restrict migration. And the Southern Border Program, just very briefly, created a series of security belts along the Mexico-Guatemalan border and across Chiapas and Oaxaca. So in addition, immigration detention facilities in Mexico have expanded and multiplied. And so actually Mexican data reveals that rates of deportation of children and adults from Mexico to Central America have actually skyrocketed, right? So we're only getting a glimpse of those that are arriving in the US. And as a consequence, Central American migrants now face really well-documented dangers traversing through Mexico, right? And the expansion of these policies into Guatemala, similarly, military training, heavy artillery, surveillance in Guatemala, where authorities hunt for Salvadorans and Hondurans and others passing through, right? In effect, we see the US-Mexico border moving south. Then also in countries of origin, I think it's important to kind of understand that the Biden administration has continued with these troubling policies that Gabriela mentioned, right? That pathologize migration, that criminalize parents, and that tie development aid to further securitization, all while ignoring, right, US complicity in perpetuating insecurity in the region, and disregarding young people and their families and what they tell us about the reasons for migration. I'll just conclude, right, by saying, I think our focus today is the US, but I think it's also important to recognize that the US isn't alone in its securitized approaches to the kind of stunning 20% increase in child migration worldwide, right? We've seen similar trends and third country agreements in the EU and Australia. I think there's some important distinctions that maybe we'll get to in the Q&A around how they respond to unaccompanied and separated children, but I think this is a global phenomenon that we're talking about today.
Thank you so much. And I think you mentioned two key elements of this, the fact that we are not only talking about, despite the fact that most of the attention has been on the US-Mexico border, how we are talking about a regional, dynamic, and also one that is being experienced throughout, in the United States, but also in the communities of origin and in transit. And also, this, the very fact, again, that there is all of these other elements that have been, part of the region for so many decades, in terms of militarization and the presence of the US government in the regions. Thank you so much. Catherine?
Yes, thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here and for the invitation to be here. So I very much appreciate Lauren's perspective, and I don't differ at all. I just want to sort of flesh out a little bit more of the historical context to say two or three things. Number one, yes, clearly especially yesterday's article, clearly illustrates that the Biden White House has known during its time about the implications of their treatment of children. This poor treatment of kids coming up to the border and entering the US through various ways has been going on for decades. And you know, Obama did some really horrible things. Trump did even worse things. G.W. Bush did some bad things. I mean, if we go back in time, I know we have the historian here with us to help us do that, but if we go back in time, we see that recent decades, there's no president whose hands are not touched, you know, are not part of the very poor, inhumane treatment of kids. And so I just want to make that clear. I have a book that hopefully the manuscript will finish this summer, where I'm not a historian, so Yvonne, I'm not doing what you're doing, but I am, you know, looking in back to recent history and saying, you know, what has been done. So that's my first kind of point of recent historical context. The other thing that really I want to make sure it's clear that people understand is that all of recent presidents, and really all throughout all of U.S. history, when kids come into the U.S. Without a guardian or with a guardian and get separated, yes, there's, you know, detention centers if they're detected by the government. Yes, they go through a process, and the process is almost always not good for kids, but they eventually might get out of that process, and then usually they do, and they settle somewhere more permanently. And yes, they settle with families. Increasingly, you know, not increasingly, but large shares of unaccompanied kids in the last, let's say, 2 decades have been placed with family sponsors. That process, if you read the reporting, Hannah's reporting recently, that process has errors and has significant problems, such that the vetting of sponsors and is not adequate by no means. By no means does it fully protect kids. But there are many, many children, increasing numbers of kids, since we have so many more kids coming in this way, who are not being living with sponsors, and as a result, they're living with usually foster families, and there's a whole then trajectory where, you know, it might be true that one kid could live with the same foster family until they age out, and another kid could live with a variety of foster families. Foster family system is not controlled by the federal government; it's controlled by the state. So there's a transfer of care and protection for children that goes from the federal government to the states, and neither the feds or the or state and localities follow kids. They don't follow kids in a way to make sure there's no one looking out for the child's well-being. And so in comparison to countries like Sweden, where the children have a outside the family or wherever they're living advocate who meets with them regularly, there's no one there for the child. So if the child has a bad situation with their either family sponsor or with their foster family, the kid could run away. And the US government and states and localities have no ways of finding those kids. So we lose our ability to even know what is going on for some share of kids. Now, I imagine it's a small share, but this has been a problem that's been going on since before Obama. And during the Obama administration, there were many people writing, both in the government and outside the government, criticizing the government for not tracking kids adequately and losing kids. So anyway, so those are, I just wanted to share those points.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, you provide us with a very specific reference to the fact that children worldwide, you know, not only in the US, but are, you know, facing these challenges, you know, when it comes to the way by governments and others Rodriguez. Yeah, my connection acting out. We are talking about history, and precisely how dehistoricized these processes have been. Would you mind sharing with us, what are some of them, all of these historical dimensions, and also perhaps also explore why is it that there's this tendency to hide or not to necessarily focus on the experiences of, youth, migrant, or migrant youth, in the United States?
Thanks so much for those questions, Gabriela, and for having me here. I'm really so honored. The first thing I want to say about history in particular is that there is a long history of child migration and migrant child labor in the US, but we hardly hear about it. And one of the reasons, I think the main reason, is because there's this presumption in historical research that children didn't migrate in the past, especially from Mexico and Central America, and that after the US banned child labor in 1938, children didn't work. And I've seen this presumption too in national discourse and media coverage, where major moments of child migration or abuse of migrant youth are depicted as aberrational, as new, or of recent invention. But some of my co-panelists really thoughtfully talked about the recent history of this. As a historian of the 20th century, I look at how even from the late 19th century and across the 20th century, millions of migrant youth arrived to the US, both with their families and as unaccompanied minors. And there were a variety of laws and policies that governed their border crossings. Even in the first few years of the 20th century, the Immigration Acts of 1907 and 1917 included provisions that made unaccompanied child migrants a deportable class of immigrants. But in those early years, the pre-1924 years, of course, the Border Patrol didn't exist, and the US had not yet built its vast deportation machine and immigrant detention infrastructure. So millions of child migrants entered the US relatively unencumbered by law enforcement, especially from Mexico, China, and Southern and Eastern Europe. And they ended up working in a wide range of industries, including railroads, mines, factories, domestic service, agriculture. In the years after that period of large-scale migration, the late 19th, early 20th century, there were mass deportation campaigns during the Great Depression and in mid-century that some of you might be familiar with, and those mass deportation campaigns uncovered evidence of undocumented child laborers. And then importantly, there were key changes to immigration policy and law post-1965 that resulted in an explosion of the human smuggling business, the growth of the US's undocumented population, and its migrant child labor problem. Those key changes involved the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 imposing numerical limits on migration from Latin America for the first time in US history. In the 1970s, the US increasingly militarizing the border. And then in the late 20th century, US refugee policy giving preferential treatment to people who were fleeing communism. So the closing of legal avenues to entry and the militarization of the border made it necessary for even unaccompanied minors to enter the US clandestinely and to purchase the services of smugglers. So this is where you start seeing alarming rates of debt bondage and labor trafficking of undocumented youth from Mexico in particular, where basically they're forced to pay off their smuggling debts. And the final thing that I want to say about the history of law and policy is that immigration policy intersected with other avenues of government service that impacted migrant youth lives and enabled their labor exploitation, namely discriminatory welfare, compulsory school attendance, and child labor policies. But we hardly hear about migrant youth's experiences in the past. In addition, because so much of the archival record about these youth are authored by adults. And that's also certainly something that I can talk about later in the conversation.
And we very much look forward to that part, because I think that is also, like part of this, the politics of research, and politics of making visible specific, experiences in migrant lives. So thank you so much for that. And fast forward, like once again, coming back to the present time and shifting a bit the focus, right, from the border to the interior to what has been happening to many of the young people who are arriving to different locations. We turned to Professor Canizales to ask her, for her insights into what is the current landscape that migrant children arriving to cities, throughout the United States are facing. Trying to, once again, as Professor Donato also showed us, if we shift the lens from the border to what is happening, in other locations.
Thanks so much for that question, and thanks for the invitation. This Zoom room is every lit review I've ever written in my life. So I just appreciate having this conversation in real time. I will be honest, I've done, now 12 years of work with unaccompanied teens and young adults who entered the US undetected and have tracked, that labor and coming of age story. So I'm, and I live near a train track, so you might hear the train passing in a few minutes, but I've really tried to, along the way, keep track of what it means to move through a formal resettlement channel and then enter into work rather than school, or navigate work and school alongside one another for children who are placed with sponsors. That's not the work that I have been doing for the last decade, but I think there's multiple pockets of the conversation, and I'm going to try to touch on a little bit of the different segments of the population. But what we've been reading in journalistic portrayals of child migrant labor is the case of children who were apprehended at the border, who moved through the custody of Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and are placed with adult, either parents or kin or non-kin sponsors. In terms of what children are experiencing in cities across the US or different states, we have read the New York Times portrayal of children in construction, slaughterhouses, food manufacturing, and other occupations across 20 states in the South, the Midwest, and the Northeast. The Washington Post reports on children in slaughterhouses in Nebraska. The Boston Globe talks about fish processing, house roofing, restaurant kitchens in Massachusetts, and Reuters talks about kids working in the car manufacturing, right? Hyundai and Kia plants. Children who are placed by staffing agencies on these plant floors, right? So there are knowing adults from the US government all the way down to staffing agencies, right? And I think in cases where children are with adults, we put, or adult parents or kin, we put a lot of emphasis, as you said earlier, Gabriela, on parents as complicit in the labor that children do, and therefore complicit in their exploitation and abuse at work. We know that there are structural reasons for the necessity of work, from grandparents all the way down now to children as young as 6 or 7 years old. There's also the cultural differences. The youth in my research talk about uno no sabe, you don't know that kids don't work in the US until you get here and you don't see kids working, right? So there's a lot that's going on in the pressures that, or the sort of, I'll just say it, the blame that's being put on parents for the conditions that children find themselves in. We're also reading a lot about the suspicious nature of non-parent and non-kin adults taking on the care of unaccompanied children. I will say the US government has also put people in this, parents, kin, caring adults in the situation where they won't name themselves as a potential sponsor for fear of deportation or being detected because of their own undocumented status or close ties to someone else who is undocumented. So again, the US being complicit in that process. And then there's attention to cities, towns, counties without extensive histories of migration that are now seeing an influx of unaccompanied kids. And we're entering into this more direct naming of the potential of mass child trafficking, right? Dozens of children ending up with the same non-kin sponsor. That's something that we should be flagging, right? I think something that's missing from the public media or policy conversation is what academics have kind of been putting forth. And I think Lauren and others are really the spearheads of this idea of unaccompanied child migrant agency. I'm thinking back to the 2014 book, 2014, Lauren, your first book, Susan Terrio, others who have sort of written articles, policy briefs. Michelle, has been doing this work for so long as well, that really emphasizes that unaccompanied child migrants have decision-making power in their families and in their communities, and they often make decisions to work alongside their family members, including their parents and their siblings. I see this in my research with young people who entered the US, as I mentioned, undetected and end up in Los Angeles, where I did my work. There are, again, there's an array of structural reasons why kids end up in work in their home countries, and then in the US, the histories of war and genocide, US intervention, discrimination, disinvestment in education, as Lauren mentioned, climate change, environmental degradation. One thing I want to emphasize, and I feel like Lauren should probably answer this question too, because I'm going to cite her second book, Migranthood, that points to how children respond to these structural reasons from a place of care, with an ethics of care, from a position of care for themselves as individuals. And I write about this in my forthcoming book. They're young people thinking about their own futures, and they care very much about themselves and their futures, but also their families and their communities, right? My research in the US, in Los Angeles, finds that their conditions, including debt, the urgency of their own financial need to find a place to live, to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, public transportation, washing their laundry at a laundromat, all of these things cost money. So there's an urgency in finding work immediately. And also the urgency of providing for their families, the siblings, the grandparents, the parents that they left behind, sometimes leaving family members behind that are sick, in need of urgent medical attention, or there's an array of family-related reasons why kids will go into work, even if there is, I found in my work, a family member who offers, don't work, I will pay for everything that you need, enroll in school, and the kid will still say, but my mom, but my siblings, and they will work instead of taking on, the role of a dependent student. There's also, I talk about, this condition of work primacy, where there's the urgency to work to survive, but then also the conditions under which youth are working make it so that there is no getting ahead. It really is just getting by, right? So the exploitation in wages, the illness and injury that youth experience in the workplace, the financial stressors, the emotional stressors, the physical stressors that make it nearly impossible to go look for another job on a Tuesday afternoon, right? And their bodies become exhausted and worn. There's very limited opportunities to kind of change the circumstance. And what I'm working on now is this idea that there's work primacy impacts over an extended period of time. So kids are aging into young adulthood, parents are aging out of the workforce, siblings are aging into the age of migration or marriage, nieces and nephews are born, costs are changing across borders. So while there's an urgency in the immediate, over the long term, there are conditions that keep youth working. And that's probably something different from the adult migrant condition, where children that are left behind might age into independence and self-sufficiency. We see the opposite happening, or I've seen the opposite happening in my data, where parents become more dependent over time. So kids, even if they wanted to eventually stop working and go to school, end up working over the longer term.
Excellent. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And something that I really appreciate from your intervention, is this continued vilification, right? The suspicious nature of the sponsor, which is something that is also emerging. And in many cases, again, hides precisely the fact that many people are not coming forward to claim, or to identify themselves as kin, giving their status. From my own work on trafficking and smuggling, how this enforces this perception, that mass trafficking of children is happening, without paying necessarily attention on how enforcement practices, are actually leading to families having to opt many times to hide their presence or their identity, or the very coming forward for for their children. So thank you so much for that. And, I think that also what you mentioned, it's a great, takes us precisely exactly to the work that Lauren and Michelle have been developing over the years, precisely on this notion of care. We do not seek to suggest problematic at many levels, that the conditions that they are facing, tend to be problematic. What is concerning at many levels is the vilification of the context in which many of these conditions, take place, or their very participation in labor. And on that, I really want to give the floor now to Michelle and Lauren, because your work has been, as Stephanie mentioned, essential at emphasizing the nature of care, what care means, and how especially and specifically how young people feel about their role at work, and also on behalf of how work becomes a form of care for themselves and also for their families. So Lauren and Michelle, who would like to go first?
I can start answering this question.
Thank you.
We'll segue to Lauren. First of all, thank you also for the invitation to speak today. And Stephanie, I really appreciate what you just shared. It was a nice setup for this particular question. So all of my research is a little bit different in that I had focused primarily on the experiences of young migrants who travel alone from China to the US and are apprehended at the US-Mexico border and placed in removal proceedings. And I think it's important to highlight that the young people who I worked with were almost all age 17 and up. So we're not talking tender age youth, certainly, but young people who had really complicated labor experiences, particularly in rural spaces, which is something I want to highlight at the very end of this little section. But the thing I think that uniquely unites Lauren's and my work, and we realized very early on in 2014, is just the ways in which prevailing narratives of migrant children and youth also have sort of an implicit or often explicit corollary in terms of narratives or tropes of their parents. So as we've shown in our writing and as we've shown in our website, Youth Circulations, there are these ideas and ideals of young migrants as victims, or sometimes as delinquents, or sometimes as economic actors, like very static tropes. And then by extension, their parents are often cast as individuals who would or would have to put their children in harm's way. That's the only explanation for this. So parents who are neglectful or abusive. And all of my work really centers on the sort of existing structures of legal status and legal relief that demand these narratives. So I don't think we can abstract that portion from this question either, but we also see it in fundraising narratives of different advocacy organizations, and certainly in media portrayals as we're discussing today. So really, I think it's the homogenizing potential of these narratives that completely abstracts and really powerfully and violently denies the fact that, like Stephanie was just saying, these young people are also decision makers in family and community contexts. So if the whole narrative of parents as being abusive and neglectful is predicated on this assumption that it's only parents or adults who are the decision makers and providers for children, which of course is like a very relativistic or non-relativistic approach to this. It's highly sort of situated in a unique moment and assumption about adulthood and parenting. And my data demonstrate this, as do Lauren's. I know she'll talk about it more. It's just the fact that, again, children, young people are playing integral roles in community and family decision-making. And not only is this around the migration journey, which includes a debt right? Like we haven't actually spoken at length yet today about the financial and social debts that are often incurred through migration, but also the ways in which these debts can kind of and I know this is like heretical in some contexts, but the ways in which these debts actually signal a real expression of trust and commitment and investment in a young person's future as well as a family's future. So that's something that we can include a lot of links to our articles on and our website on. But I will say in my work with Chinese youth specifically from Fujian province, it came out again and again and again in talking to young people that their labor, that their migration, that the debt was incurred in migration, again, really highlighted the role that youth played in a transnational family network, and one that in which all of the players were negotiating in a very complex way around family survival and also betterment. And I think the thing that was so profoundly striking and evocative of this reality, which does not at all deny the labor conditions in which these young people worked, was what happened when the young Chinese migrants who I was collaborating with were suddenly confronted with these narratives of their parents as abusive and neglectful, particularly in the context of debt and of transnational migration. And these narratives do a profound violence to young people. There was like a very visceral reaction among a lot of the youth that I worked with, people just being stunned at this kind of accounting of their family and parents, being shocked, being very hurt at what these portrayals of parents do, both in the legal context, that's again where my work was situated, but also beyond it. So I think just holding that up in some relief ultimately complicates and very necessarily complicates these understandings of indebtedness and labor. But I do want to highlight something that Stephanie just said, which is the conditions that keep youth working. I think that's so I'm answering the question, but I also want to add on to that other thread of the conversation, which is that all of my work now is on access to justice in rural, tribal, and state court jurisdictions. So it's a little bit different. But what led me there was ultimately following the labor journeys of Chinese youth, the majority of whom work in construction, in Chinese restaurants, in small towns, and in nail salons at that time of research. And again, I don't think we can abstract the spatiality dimension from this conversation. And when we're thinking about youth labor, and particularly, what does it mean, like you said, Stephanie, to be working in exploitative labor conditions for long hours, but also not be able to take public transit anywhere and not be able to access those critical services that ostensibly exist in more urban environments, and that simply don't in rural areas. And we know from the data that so many young migrants, not just Chinese youth, end up in these industries, like you were saying, in slaughterhouses, et cetera, in more rural communities. And that piece has to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think just to emphasize, right, I think this kind of criminalization of parents individualizes responsibility for the causes and consequences of migration, right? So it's a application of responsibility from the state, right, and places the responsibility on the parent. And I think part of it rests in not fully understanding the reasons for migration or the context in which decisions were made, or how young people themselves understand their labor. So I have done work within ORR facilities and with young people post-release, but more recently been working with Guatemalan youth, primarily indigenous youth, who were deported from the US and Mexico as they return to their home communities. And it's really struck me about how young people talk about their labor, right, and their contributions. And I think at once it's contextual because their migration, as I mentioned, right, is deeply ingrained in their formative experiences, right? One young man named Alfredo Quiche Youth said, it's just what we do, because todos somos migrantes, we're all migrants, right? And another youth, Ignacio, who's my mom, said, hemos hecho desde siempre. Like we've always done this. We've always migrated, and whether that's internal or seasonal or regional, increasingly transnational, right? There is this long history, particularly within indigenous communities in present day Guatemala, right, of violence and displacement during the genocide, colonialism before that, right, and currently with extractive developments. And so, families are using their mobility, their labor, right, as a historically rooted strategy for survival of their multi-generational households. So the idea that parents are being, abusing their children by sending them, I mean, I think I take issue with that narrative as well, right, is totally dehistoricized and totally decontextualized from how young people and their families talk about their decision to migrate and their experiences of migration and labor. And I think it's also important to recognize that migration and labor are relational, like Michelle was talking about, right? That young people are critical contributors to household economies. It's a form of of intergenerational caregiving, right? That, as Michelle mentioned, right? Families are investing in a young person, in their future, right? And there was actually one youth that, David, that has been in the US for probably 10 years now. And he talks about the debt families incur to fund the migration of their child, and saying, look, it's really not that different than you taking out, a high interest loan to fund your child to go to college, right? You're taking on this debt to invest in the future. The context is different. I'm not going to university, I'm working to support my family, I'm working to have a future, not just in an individualistic sense, right, but in a sense of trying to invest in one's family and in one's future well-being. And so, I think in the cultural context in which young people, particularly indigenous Guatemalans, are migrating, right, their migration is understood as one father shared with me, un acto de amor, right? It's an act of love. And so I think that stands in really violent contrast to these depictions of parents. And so, it may shock US middle-class sensibilities, right? But for many families, a child's migration, as heart-wrenching as it is the most rational choice, right? Their families are surviving, they're negotiating, and they're adapting to circumstances not of their own choosing.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Stephanie, you want to reply to them, because I think this is very much connected to your work.
I'm just like kind of blown I'm blown away, because it's we all do research in different areas with different populations, but the narratives are the same, right? Like the understanding of labor in this way that Lauren was describing, which is why I take issue with this the policy response of like intervene and get kids out of work that doesn't actually put kids in context. It doesn't put young people in context and really takes them out of, most importantly, the context of the family. But we can get into that later. I'm just kind of nodding along and I'm very excited about that.
No, thank you so much. I think, what this last intervention also made me think about is precisely on in what Michelle mentioned, how legal relief is dependent. And so it's really on all of these tropes, right, of the irresponsible or even cruel parent, on how again just this persona of the smuggler, the debt, the solution of the debt that is only constructed in strictly financial terms, and not necessarily bringing in all of these elements of trust, which, as we have seen in the work that all of us do with young people, is this commitment to a community, to a family. It's not merely a financial transaction. So understanding some of those dimensions perhaps can help us understand how important it is to ground this from below, rather than just from all of these policies that keep just punishing and again imposing additional layers of surveillance on families and also on young people that ultimately are not really resulting or improving any of the conditions that they face. So I think that on that, I would, just ask another question to our historian. Go back to, having, you have not only, Yvonne, you have only not only seeing all of these historical dimensions, but how, and I think that also doing what Lauren just said, how the power of testimonials, testimonies of young people, conversation, have people, people who are not, this is also part of the out. Do we see differences in the way people used to speak about their experiences in the past to the ways in which they are speaking about them today?
Thanks so much for the question. You cut out a little bit, but I think I'm
sorry.
understanding
Okay.
what the question was about the testimonies in the archival record about migrants and the way that they self-perceive their experiences versus how they're being discussed now.
Mhm.
Did I understand? Okay.
Yes. Sorry, apologies for the connection. Yes, but
No,
do
you're
we
totally
see-
fine.
Mhm.
I first want to echo what Stephanie was saying about how I am in awe that we, so many of us are tackling similar problems and questions from different disciplines, and yet there is so much continuity across what we're doing. And then I think too about how historians talk a lot about change over time, and yet I find that on this question of migrant child labor, on child and family migration, there's a lot of continuity. So much of what my co-panelists have been saying about how migrant youth perceive and articulate their migration, their contributions to their family survival, the way even to that, of course, like the state has criminalized parents to individualize the consequences of US border enforcement policy and the militarization of the border. All of that I see in my research, particularly in the mid and the late 20th century. So when it comes to testimonies of migrants, yes, there are divergences from how we talk about migrant youth today, but also how US policy has interacted with these child migrants. So while most of the archival records that I examine in my research are authored by adults, that's most of what you're going to find in the historical record. I've also been very fortunate actually to have identified some traces of migrant children's voices, their motivations, their self-perceptions in the mid and late 20th century as they're reflecting on their work and their educational deprivation as minors. And what I've learned from these records, again, in the 20th century, is that historically, US legal systems and policymakers tended to either kind of like over infantilize on the one hand migrant youth, strip them of their agency, misrepresent their experiences and their aspirations, or adultify and criminalize migrant youth on the other. Migrant minors often expressed a desire to obtain educational advancement while at the same time recognizing their financial precarity and wanting to support their families. So migrant youth in the past were in fact decision makers, to use the language of my co-panelists, who wanted educational opportunity and safe work opportunity. They came to the US with work experience from Mexico and Central America. That labor was seen as carrying social and familial value, and some kids made their own decisions to migrate. So of course, parents in the past were not the only decision-making persons in this story.
Thank you so much. What I, this kind of, wants to, I want to, what you just mentioned makes me want to go back a little bit into some part of Stephanie's work. Because many times, again, we see, and it is very important, and I think that all of us have seen the role of families, how important it is to, for people to have the family, to have the support of families. But we also know that many young migrants are traveling to get away in many cases from families, or to try to start, like over with this new space. So I know that Stephanie, that you have specifically, in some cases, look at the experiences of young people who are traveling in a more, I don't want to see, because I think this is another element of the story, that many times when we say unaccompanied, we just talk about them as if they just showed up, right? With nobody helping them. But many times there is some of this experience actually takes place in a very lonely, more than unaccompanied, many times they have to encounter some of these challenges on their own. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in my research, I have cases of children who are definitely in conditions of domestic violence and attempting to leave their families and sever ties with abusive parents or tios or tias. And I have cases of children whose parents passed and they were alone and make their way to the US, and also children who were abandoned, right, and make their way to the US. So those are definite. It isn't all family care and family ties, but what I've found in again, my work sort of follows along the coming of age trajectory of kids who arrive as minors, and I interview them over the age of 18. So, thinking back about their settlement experiences, and really regardless of what their connection is to family in the origin country, or whether or not they're siblings, family members in the US, what youth talk about is, or the young people that I do work with talk about, is the need to have intimate social ties to desahogar, to unburden. Ahogar is to drown, so to undrown from the trauma, the violence, the experiences of displacement, migration, and settlement in the US. I talk in the book about the need for orientation to what the youth describe as a US sistema. How do you enroll in school? How do you find a job? How do you find an apartment? How do you board a bus? And when do you know when to get off, right? Like the orientation to the very practical things about surviving in a new place. And as Michelle said, I'm talking about an urban environment, right? And then also youth talk about the need to orientación for the point of adaptación, adapting to life. And that isn't incorporation or assimilation in the way that, sociologists and other social scientists have talked about, but really just a matter of like surviving and getting by in the places in which they settle. To Lauren's point, and to your point earlier, Gabriela, about indigenous youth, they specifically talk about the need for preparación, education, and or some kind of language learning in Spanish, and then maybe eventually the English language learning. And these are terms that youth presented to me, and even young people that didn't know each other would use the same terms. Preparación, adaptación, orientación, desahogo was a big one. So I think it points to the need for like socio-emotional support, intimacy of ties, whether they're transnational or local. And I write a chapter on what youth refer to as perdición, perdition. Young people talked about the US being un lugar de perdición, a place where young people could squander, right? Like become lost in the pressures. And this is an antithesis to the adaptación framework that youth kind of make sense of. But a lot of it is tied in this need to be witnessed, this need to be seen, acknowledged, recognized, and young people, as I said earlier, this emergent frame of reference where they see their kids with parents who are in school. There are undocumented young people who have DACA, and that's a contentious another debate, but they see that there are forms of recognition and support. So just this idea of witnessing becomes really important to buffering, the fine line between adaptación and perdición, right? Adaptation and potential perdition. And I think just that, like drawing out the emotional component, regardless of what family ties is, because we are talking about newcomer young people, but also adolescents that are developing identities and, trying to make sense of their place in the world. So it's a two-part sort of coming of age pathway, I think.
Thank you so much. Your reference to perdición reminded me of my mom and why they didn't want me to leave. Because that was, I was, es el lugar de la perdición, that's the place of perdition and doom, that was not good for women. It was great for the guys, but it was not really that great for women. Catherine, we know that, you have been doing all of this, documentary, work, precisely, collecting all of this data and these reflections and these experiences about the many times this very important context that Stephanie was just talking about, this dimensions of intimacy, the role of education, and all of these perceptions that are connected with the new country. Would you like to share a little bit about that work in the context of the conversation?
Well, like Stephanie, I have been interviewing more than 100 immigrant adults who came in as unaccompanied kids. But a little bit different, although our work definitely overlaps, is that, I have people who are in my sample who are 50, as well as people who are 18, coming from countries all over the world. And, so much of what everybody has said holds true for my sample. One of the things we're currently writing about right now is the use of, we don't have really good words for this, but the uncovering of resources that children, either during their journey or after they arrive, and young adults find in their communities. And I think Stephanie said it may not be your own family, right? But it may be this relationship with someone who provides, who you can be intimate with in terms of sharing what you're going through, and they can provide you some resources. So we're writing currently about the trauma and the set of traumas that continue after people come to the US, even if they have legal status, right? Because they're young. Every single unaccompanied child who's come into the US has experienced some trauma in that they had to leave home, even in the best of cases, right? And of course, we have many, many examples of not the best of cases. So we're writing about the intersection between the protective resources that people talk about in terms of being very important. Let's say when I was trying to cross and the smuggler left me and I didn't know where I was, and then it ended up somebody carried me across, or I could, so individual protective resources that might emerge during the journey, but also emerge after people come into the US. So our study looks at the DC metro area. So we have the city comparison to the state of Michigan. And Michigan is, in the last 10 to 15 years, has received more unaccompanied children from the federal government than any other state. And it's got a pretty deep nonprofit set of resources for children, but understanding when children are protected by those resources and when they slip through the cracks is something that we're also looking at. So we're looking at sort of the trauma. Right now, I'm currently writing a chapter about the trauma that these people have experienced early on in their move from origin to destination. And then the sorts of protective resources that are out there that some children at the time can actually, receive, because that's the other issue, as Stephanie said, these are young people coming of age, trying to figure themselves out. And at the same time, they have to realize if there is a good person in their midst who's offering them help, they have to be able to say, yes, I could use that. And so there's a lot of dynamics here. But anyway, so that's what I've been writing about and we'll write about all summer.
Thank you so much. Something that I also really like from your intervention here is this role of solidarity. That I think that many times in this logic of seeing labor as exploitative alone, or the deaths that people incur, being seen as exploitative only, obscure precisely all of this network of care and support, that exists. And I was also thinking, how many times these forms of protection or all of this, el sistema, right, Steph? El sistema, what as young migrants, as people who have just arrived, they are told to navigate through, how asking for help within the settings is so different from the ways in which they have been socialized into securing help and assistance. So it is not necessarily, once again, the community, but also now it's a structure that they have to decode, decodify and navigate. So thanks also for bringing that up. I'm mindful of the time, and I know that we already have a few questions right there in the chat, but I think that one of the most important, right, motivations for us to have this conversation was precisely to try to move the conversation forward a little, because it tends, typically when people start to talk about child labor, immediately the response is, let's crack down on this, let's launch another investigation, let's impose fines and penalties on industry, and as if that is going to miraculously get rid of exploitation and abuse on the one hand, but also as if this was a viable solution to young people and their families. And one of the concerns that I think all of us share in this sense is also how many of these messages or this rhetoric silences, it's very efficient at silencing what young people and their families actually want. So I think, this is my question for the entire panel, right? Is like precisely this, what's at the core, of this, all of this proposed measures, another, very specific reaction that followed the New York Times article was, I think it was the same day or the following day that the White House said that that's it, we're going to put a stop on all of this, and we're going to create commissions, which again, as Yvonne's work shows, and also, from the record, we have seen this happen over and over. So the question here would be, do crackdowns work? And I'll leave it at that for now. And also let's think about that. Is that actually a viable solution? Does cracking down on migrant, young people's labor, along these lines, does that work? I don't know who wants to go first. I can go with Yvonne, since you are right here, the first person in my screen.
I'm actually glad you came to me first, because while I certainly want to defer to my co-panelists about the potential viability of crackdowns in the contemporary moment and in the near future, history has something to say about this, actually. In my own research, I find that companies and corporations acted with impunity in the mid and late 20th century, and often increased fines, persecution for child labor violations, criminalized parents, and created additional precarity for children and their families. There was even like a Washington Post article a few days after Hannah Dryer's initial reporting that was called "A Cleaning Company Illegally Employed a 13-year-old. Her family is paying the price." And it talked about how her parents were then they were facing child abuse charges and potential deportation. This was the case in the mid and late 20th century too, where fines for child labor violations were imposed on parents, not the employers, and it was migrant families who faced the possibility of incarceration and deportation for supposedly subjecting their kids to the dangers of migration.
I think I just would add on to this, right? I mean, the immediate fallout of this series of articles, right, on the young people who are featured in them, in terms of losing their employment, in terms of not being able to return, and then the very real and material consequences, both in the immediate term, but also the long term on families. It's not to condone child labor and say that they should be in these factories, but I think in some ways it does distract from the conditions within the factories for adults as well. Right? This isn't just about the conditions for children, but also from adults. And so I think it kind of moves us away from looking at the structural reasons. I also think it's, I always kind of, when I think about, okay, well, what's the solution here, right? Of returning to and really centering the voices and perspectives of young people. And I think that there are other kind of national contexts we can look at. I think of the Bolivian working children's movement. I think the working children's movement in Peru, where they wrote the labor law in Bolivia for, look, this is the reality we're confronting. We need to work to survive, to contribute to our families. This is part of our kind of cultural identity, to be contributors to intergenerational household economies, right? So let's let's acknowledge the rights and protections we need in place in order to labor. Now, I don't necessarily think that would happen in the US, but I do think that there are lessons there of really listening to young people and what they need. And I think in addition, in the context of this series of articles, right, really focusing on children who have passed through federal detention facilities run by Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR sets a series of expectations for sponsors, whomever they are, right, but doesn't equip them to realize those expectations. So a child is supposed to go to school, but there's not intensive case management services provided to all children, right? And you go to states that are very reluctant to honor prior veto, right? That don't want children to enroll in school, particularly if they're 16 or 17 or have low literacy rates. They tell them that they need to go to court, but don't provide, other than a list of legal service providers, don't provide any support or government funds, right, for representation as we do in other areas of law. They say you need to go to the doctor and continue, if you are on medication, but you don't have healthcare, you don't have health insurance, right? So it continues to be this externalization of responsibility to individual migrants and their families and their communities, rather than kind of setting children up for success, right? As you would hope, right, in the domestic system. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. But I think that whereas in other national contexts, you have a national child welfare system, now we have it at the state level, yet ORR functions at the federal level, and never the two shall meet. And so I think that there are some there are ways in which the federal government could lead, right, and could be working more closely with states to ensure that kids are getting the supports that they need in the communities post-release.
Thank you.
Can
so
I
much.
jump in here? I appreciate Lauren's comments. I also think, there's the immediate response to crack down on labor, which individualizes and, as Lauren says, externalizes the reasons, or like who's actually to blame here. I also think there's been, a conversation about states that are moving in the direction of changing, the labor regulations, some minimum wage for minors, lowering the floor for how old 14, 16, how old someone has to be to do certain work. There's the disaggregation of industries. In agriculture, you can be this old. In factories, you can, so there's a lot of things that are changing also, as Lauren mentioned, on the state level as a response to sort of shift the blame, I think, and again, puts it back onto the families and the individuals for the conditions that they're facing. So I think attention to the labor conditions, as Lauren says, it's not just kids, but if there's a layer of like kids specifically should not be facing this, but no human should be under the work conditions that a lot of the stories tell, right? Whose spine should be shattered at work, who should be crushed under a conveyor belt. Like these just aren't dignifying human conditions to do labor, period. And that, I think, is where the conversation should really move in the direction of. And I think, there's also, I'm a part of a statewide program in California, as Lauren mentioned, the post-release service component, and sort of tying the federal and the state response to children's lives, the reality and of the complexity of children's lives as workers, as family members, as heads of household in some cases, right? In the state of California, there's a program, the Opportunities for Youth program, that is centered on post-release services for hard to reach, non-traditional, out of K through 12 schools, in students, of course, but also really focuses on being culturally responsive and trauma informed as a way to sort of capture the, teen moms, youth workers, tender aged youth, kids who are aging out of systems of support, right? And the program really focuses on things like program navigation, mentorship, supporting sponsors and knowing how to navigate the sistema themselves, right? And really humanizes the young people and puts them into context rather than saying, you should be in school, you should be doing this, like asking them, what are your goals and how can we support you in getting you there? Because that recognizes that youth have agency, a sense of self, and an aspiration for the direction of their lives. And I think if the state is responsible for filling the gaps that the federal government is not effectively doing, the Opportunities for Youth program is perhaps an example, and I'm happy to share a link to an article I just wrote on it. But I think that's a way to think about how we can support youth workers in a way that centers their humanity.
Thank you so much. And I think, as a brief parenthesis, that actually addresses one of the questions that has been, asked in the Q&A, how, because there's, again, this expectations, right, that many times are imposed by case managers or social workers that are not necessarily in line or with those of young people, like their goals and their expectations do not necessarily align with many of the social expectations of a teenager, like was this many times this middle class aspirations that could be that the legal system, social service system may have in mind. Catherine, I don't know if there's some things, any reactions or any comments to that, for the crackdowns?
Well, to the crackdowns, I mean,
or in general, yes.
Yeah, the bottom line is crackdowns aren't going to solve any problem here related to these children, especially, and to child migration. And we have a strong historical record going back showing that. I just was, so, that said, I wanted to say, just on this issue of what could be done, and Stephanie brings up the program in California. I know that in the state of Michigan, through the largest nonprofit that resettles or helps to resettle, facilitates the resettlement of unaccompanied kids, that they have a few, just I believe 3, group homes where they take kids who age out of services, and it's very few number of beds. Total, I think it's about 24 beds across these 3 places, but they will provide all of the supporting services, it sounds like, that this Opportunities program for Youth does for California. It's a different way to do it, right? They're not in a state probably where there's enough support for this to be state legislation. But the nonprofit is committed to frankly, I think all 3 of these group homes opened up in 2017, 18, and 19, and they're committed to supporting them. So there are, I almost feel like when we talk about these children who come, whatever their experiences are, they go through the system, they don't go through the system at the border, but they eventually get to wherever it is they're going to long-term live. It's almost like, I feel like it's a crapshoot for them. If they don't have family that's helping to ground them somewhere, they could be anywhere in the US where services are extremely thin. And that might be rural areas, but frankly, I tend to see these as, states that maybe has a lot of rural areas, but they're mostly suburban places where walking to work, for example. I have someone in my sample who came to the US when she was 13, got lived with a foster home in a foster family until she was 15, when she could start working by state law part-time. And she had to walk 4 miles each way after going to school. And then after 1 month, her foster family started asking her for rent, which is explicitly against, right, the state's systems and the state laws and rules around foster families. And it took her about 16 months until she was able to tell the nonprofit who occasionally checked in with her to see how things were going, where she felt strong enough and confident enough to be able to say, well, they're asking for $100 a week, which meant that she had to work even more hours, right, in order to get the little bit of money that she needed. So, so I guess I just, one of the things that various people have said is that there's a spatial dimension here, and there really is a spatial dimension here. That's really important if we think that we want to improve the lives of these kids and you know, help them become the adults that they want to be, right? And but to do that, it's almost like you have to sort of hope that they are going to be somewhere either where their families can take care of them and the state and the institutional structure is at least somewhat supportive, as you know, some states can be in different times and moments, or the localities and the nonprofit infrastructure is good. But there are many, many places where that's not the case, where these kids are living or moving through. And that's especially worrisome if we think about what the trajectory is going to be like in 10 years, 20 years.
Thank you so much. Michelle.
I don't have very much to add here at all. I think everything that's been said is important and obvious. And at the risk of adding, not obvious, but important, obvious to us maybe, and hopefully will become more obvious to the powers that be. But I can't help but thinking throughout this conversation about some of the really critical scholarship on trafficking. And I don't think it's come up yet in this conversation, but we're not talking in any sort of systematic higher level way either about demand, right? So we're talking about labor protections and different kinds of legal status and supports for young people, but the realities are also, I'm thinking about these different industries, right? And the ways in which I know I'm certainly complicit in wanting certain services at a certain price, and what does that mean in terms of this context and space? So I'll end there, but really appreciate this sort of 30,000-foot view that we're on right now.
Thank you so much, because I think that what you just mentioned brings us at the corner like of many of these concerns, the fact that we can only think of migrants as workers, that we don't see beyond that, that it's, that many times being seen or being spoken for as a migrant is to be spoken as a labor, as part of the labor force, and not necessarily, looking at all of these other dimensions and elements that we've been looking at. I saw, some of the questions as part of the Q&A, and I think that our speakers have tackled, some of your questions. The fact that trying to align some of our own expectations, our own biases, as coming from, a professional, legal, educational, social service settings, with the lived experiences of the people that we work with. This is specific examples that are institutional or more at the state level, but also the greater recognition of how communities are mobilizing and are doing the best that they can at providing also forms of support and solidarity that are not very often spoken about, are also ways in which people are trying, are fighting and are resisting in many cases the exploitation that is inherent, not necessarily to not to labor, but again, not to labor only, but to the very fact, and here looking back at the root, the fact that there are no available pathways for people to obtain documents that allow them to travel safely, that they, specifically in the case of young people, these pathways are not accessible to them. And that, how rather than criminalizing parents or also labeling them quite often in the case of Indigenous families as being ignorant or being out of the loop for what is happening, acknowledging the fact that many of these activities in the very act of migrating, as Lauren also mentioned earlier, is an act of love. Mhm. And that carries so much responsibility and care. Mhm. That is, once again, transnational. That is not only limited to the border or to destination countries, as we said at the beginning. We have run out of time, but I want to thank all of you, as presenters. We were talking before the webinar started on how we have not met in person, many of us, but hopefully, we will do that in the future, and how this webinars actually allow us to come together. We are grateful to all of you as audience and participants that who joined us this morning. And there's going to be a recording of the session. So, Gillian has also been sharing with us all of these links to the reports and the programs and the projects that we have been mentioning during the webinar. We also encourage you, of course, to follow the work of the collaborative online and to stay in touch with all of us. I think that we are really eager, to continue creating these spaces for collaboration and communication. So thanks once again to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, everyone.